On a blustery day in August of the year 1642, King Charles I raised his royal standard at Nottingham Castle. The wind howled across the battlements as the heavy banner struggled to unfurl against the darkening sky. This was not merely a ceremonial display of pomp, but a desperate declaration of war against his own people. The ancient medieval fortress stood as a grim witness to a fractured nation teetering on the edge of an abyss. Rain lashed against the stone walls while loyal subjects and curious onlookers gathered with bated breath to witness the beginning of a tragedy. The standard itself was blown down that very night, which many observers interpreted as an ill omen for the royalist cause. The conflict that was about to engulf England, Scotland, and Ireland was born from a deep ideological chasm. At the heart of the struggle lay the concept of the divine right of kings. Charles believed with absolute conviction that his authority came directly from God and could not be questioned by any earthly power. Opposing him stood a parliament that had grown increasingly confident and assertive in its demands for rights and representation. They sought to curb the absolute power of the monarchy and ensure that the voice of the landed gentry and merchants was heard. This was a battle for the very soul of the nation and the future of governance itself. King Charles I was a man of refined tastes and deep religious piety, but he lacked the political flexibility required for the turbulent times. He was a patron of the arts and a devoted family man, yet he remained aloof and distant from the common people he ruled. His marriage to a Catholic princess named Henrietta Maria fueled suspicions among his Protestant subjects that he intended to restore Catholicism to England. These fears were compounded by his authoritarian rule during the 11 years he governed without calling a parliament. To his supporters, he was a martyr for the church and the crown, while to his enemies, he was a tyrant who held himself above the law. Tensions had reached a boiling point in January of 1642, when Charles marched into the House of Commons with armed guards to arrest 5 members of Parliament. It was an unprecedented breach of privilege that shattered any remaining trust between the monarch and his legislative body. The 5 members had already fled down the river, but the damage was irrevocable. The king had shown he was willing to use force against the elected representatives of the people. London erupted in riots and protests, forcing Charles to flee the capital for the safety of the north. The lines were drawn and families across the country were forced to choose between loyalty to the king or support for Parliament. As the summer of 1642 faded into autumn, both sides scrambled to raise armies and secure strategic strongholds. The royalists, known as Cavaliers, tended to draw support from the aristocracy and the rural north and west. They were often depicted as dashing figures with long hair and flamboyant clothing. The parliamentarians, known as Roundheads, found their strength in the merchants and middle classes of London and the southeast. They were characterized by their shorter haircuts and austere religious views. However, these distinctions were never absolute, and many families found themselves split down the middle, with brother fighting against brother and father against son in a tragic civil strife. The first major engagement of the war took place at Edgehill in October of 1642. Both armies were inexperienced and poorly equipped, stumbling into battle with more enthusiasm than tactical skill. Prince Rupert of the Rhine, the dashing nephew of the king, led the royalist cavalry with reckless abandon. His charge swept the parliamentarian horse from the field, but his men chased the fleeing enemy too far, leaving the royalist infantry exposed. The battle descended into a bloody and chaotic stalemate as night fell over the freezing countryside. Thousands of men lay dead or dying in the fields, and neither side could claim a decisive victory. It was a sobering introduction to the horrors of modern warfare. Following the inconclusive result at Edgehill, the king had a golden opportunity to march on London and end the war quickly. However, he hesitated and allowed the parliamentarian forces to regroup and organize the defense of the capital. When the royalists finally advanced, they were turned back at Turnham Green by a massive citizen army that outnumbered them significantly. Charles retreated to Oxford, which became his wartime capital for the duration of the conflict. The university city was transformed into a garrison town filled with soldiers, courtiers, and spies. The colleges were converted into barracks and armories, while the king held court in Christ Church Hall, surrounded by his dwindling resources. While the king consolidated his position in Oxford, a minor country gentleman from Huntingdon was beginning to make his mark on the war. Oliver Cromwell was a devout Puritan who believed he was an instrument of divine. He saw the early failures of the parliamentarian forces as a result of poor discipline and a lack of religious conviction. Cromwell began to recruit men of spirit who feared God and made some conscience of what they did. He trained them ruthlessly, instilling in them a strict code of conduct and unwavering loyalty. These soldiers would form the nucleus of a military machine that would eventually sweep all before it. The war dragged on through 1643, with a series of skirmishes and sieges that swung the advantage back and forth. The Royalists enjoyed early successes in the north and west, capturing key cities like Bristol and York. Prince Rupert continued to be a terrifying presence on the battlefield, earning a reputation for invincibility. However, the parliamentarians possessed a crucial advantage in their control of London and the major ports. This allowed them to collect taxes and customs duties, providing a steady stream of revenue to fund the war effort. The king relied on donations and melted down silverware, which was a finite resource that slowly bled his cause dry. Recognizing the need for allies, Parliament entered into a solemn league and covenant with the Scots in late 1643. In exchange for military support, Parliament agreed to reform the English Church along Presbyterian lines. This alliance brought a powerful Scottish army into the north of England, threatening the Royalist stronghold there. Charles responded by negotiating a ceasefire with the Catholic rebels in Ireland, allowing him to bring troops back across the Irish Sea. This move proved to be a propaganda disaster, as it seemed to confirm the worst fears of the populace regarding the king's sympathies towards Catholicism. The turning point of the war in the north came on a thundery evening in July 1644 at Marston Moor outside York. It was the largest battle of the entire Civil War, involving nearly 45,000 men. The combined forces of the Scots and parliamentarians faced off against Prince Rupert and the Royalist Northern Army. As a summer storm broke overhead, the Allied forces launched a surprise attack just as the Royalists were settling down for the evening. The shock of the assault threw the Royalist ranks into confusion, and despite a valiant defense, they were overwhelmed. Oliver Cromwell led his cavalry from the Eastern Association, with devastating effect at Marston Moor. His troopers, who were now known as Ironsides, displayed remarkable discipline by charging and then regrouping instead of chasing plunder. They smashed the Royalist horse and then turned on the infantry in the center. The slaughter was immense, with over 4,000 Royalists dead left on the field. Prince Rupert was forced to hide in a bean field to escape capture, effectively ending his reputation for invincibility. The north of England was lost to the king forever, and the balance of power had shifted decisively. Despite the victory at Marston Moor, the parliamentarian leadership remained divided and indecisive. Many of the aristocratic commanders were reluctant to inflict a total defeat on the king, fearing the social upheaval that might follow. They sought a negotiated settlement rather than a military conquest. This hesitation led to the Second Battle of Newbury, where the king was allowed to escape despite being outnumbered. Cromwell and his allies in Parliament grew increasingly frustrated with what they saw as the incompetence and lack of zeal among the senior generals. They demanded a complete overhaul of the military command structure. The result of this political struggle was the self-denying ordinance passed by Parliament in early 1645. This legislation required all members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords to resign their military commands. It was a brilliant maneuver designed to remove the old aristocratic leadership without causing a mutiny. At the same time, Parliament authorized the creation of the new model army. This was to be a professional fighting force paid regularly and uniformed in red coats. It was the first national standing army in English history, and it was designed for one purpose, which was to win the war. Sir Thomas Fairfax was appointed Lord General of the new model army, with Oliver Cromwell serving as his Lieutenant General of the Horse. Fairfax was a talented and respected soldier who worked tirelessly to organize and train the new force. The ranks were filled with men chosen for their ability rather than their social status. Religious fervor ran high within the army, with soldiers spending their downtime in prayer and listening to sermons. They went into battle singing psalms, convinced that the Lord of Hosts was fighting on their side. This combination of professional discipline and religious zeal created a formidable weapon. The decisive clash between the new model army and the royalist forces came in June 1645, near the village of Naseby in Northamptonshire. The king had taken the field himself, hoping to crush this upstart new army before it could fully coalesce. The royalists occupied a strong position on a ridge, but were lured down into the valley by a feigned retreat. As the two lines clashed, the royalist infantry fought with desperate courage, pushing the parliamentarian foot soldiers back. However, on the flanks, the story was different. Cromwell's cavalry once again proved superior, driving the royalist horse from the field. With the royalist cavalry scattered, Cromwell turned his Ironsides against the exposed flank of the royalist infantry. The result was a massacre. The veteran royalist foot soldiers were surrounded and forced to surrender in droves. The king attempted to lead his lifeguard in a desperate counter-charge, but was held back by one of his earls, who grabbed the bridle of his horse. Charles was forced to flee the field, leaving behind his artillery, his baggage train, and his private papers. The defeat at Naseby was absolute and catastrophic, destroying the last effective field army available to the king. The capture of the king's baggage train at Naseby revealed a treasure trove of secret correspondence. These letters exposed Charles' attempts to bring in foreign troops from Ireland and France to fight against his own people. Parliament published these letters, immediately damaging the king's reputation beyond repair. Even his moderate supporters were horrified by the revelation that he was willing to unleash foreign mercenaries on English soil. The myth of the benevolent monarch was shattered, replacing it with the image of a treacherous tyrant who would stop at nothing to regain his absolute power. Following Naseby, the new model army embarked on a mopping-up operation across the west of England. They stormed Bristol, which was held by Prince Rupert, sending the king's nephew into exile. One by one, the remaining royalist garrisons surrendered or were taken by storm. Basinghouse, a massive royalist fortress, was leveled to the ground after a brutal siege. By the spring of 1646, the king had no armies left in the field. In a final desperate gamble, Charles disguised himself as a servant and slipped out of Oxford to surrender himself to the Scottish army besieging Newark. Charles hoped that he could exploit the growing divisions between the Scots and the English Parliament. He believed that the Scots would restore him to the throne in exchange for religious concessions. However, the Scots were not easily wooed. They held the king as a virtual prisoner while they negotiated with Parliament for the payment of their war expenses. When Parliament agreed to pay a substantial sum, the Scots handed Charles over to the English commissioners. The king was escorted south to Holmby House, where he was held under house arrest while the victors argued over what to do with him. The end of the fighting did not bring peace. Parliament and the army began to quarrel over back pay and the future political settlement of the nation. The army had become a hotbed of radical political ideas, with soldiers demanding not just pay, but a voice in government. They formed a council of the army to represent their interests and began to debate the very nature of the English Constitution. In a bold move, a cornet named George Joyce led a troop of horse to seize the king from parliamentary custody and bring him under the control of the army. Charles now saw an opportunity to play his enemies off against each other. He negotiated with the army leaders, then with Parliament, and secretly with the Scots. He was convinced that no stable government could be formed without him, and that he only needed to bide his time. His duplicity eventually led to the outbreak of the Second Civil War in 1648. Royalist uprisings flared in Kent and Essex, while a Scottish army invaded from the north in support of the king. The army felt betrayed by the man they had tried to negotiate with in good faith. The Second Civil War was short and brutal. Fairfax crushed the uprisings in the south, while Cromwell marched north to deal with the Scots. At the Battle of Preston, Cromwell displayed his tactical genius by destroying a Scottish army twice the size of his own. The victory was total, but the mood in the army had darkened. They no longer saw Charles as a misguided monarch, but as a man of blood who was responsible for all the death and suffering of the renewed conflict. At prayer meetings, soldiers called for justice to be done upon the king. Parliament, however, was still dominated by moderates who wanted to continue negotiations with Charles. They voted to accept the king's concessions as a basis for a treaty. The army leadership decided they had had enough. In December 1648, Colonel Thomas Pride stationed his troops at the entrance to the House of Commons. He systematically barred or arrested those members who were supportive of a treaty with the king. This event became known as Pride's Purge. The remaining members, known as the Rump Parliament, were fully aligned with the army's demand for justice. The Rump Parliament moved quickly to establish a High Court of Justice to try the king for treason. It was a revolutionary concept, for in the 17th century treason was defined as a crime against the king. How could the king commit treason against himself? The legal minds of the army argued that treason was a crime against the people in the kingdom, and that the king held his office in trust. If he betrayed that trust, he was liable to punishment like any other man. Charles was brought to Westminster Hall in January 1649 to face his accusers. The trial of Charles I was a spectacle unlike anything seen in Europe. The king sat alone in a velvet chair, facing the commissioners who sat on tiered benches. He refused to remove his hat as a sign of disrespect for the court, and refused to enter a plea. He argued with great eloquence that the court had no legal authority to try him. He claimed that a king could not be judged by his subjects, and that he stood for the liberties of the people against the arbitrary power of the sword. Despite his spirited defense, the outcome was never really in doubt. For day after day, the court heard evidence of the king's role in starting the war and his approval of the bloodshed. Charles continued to deny the jurisdiction of the court, often laughing in the faces of his judges. However, the tide of history was against him. On January 27th, the court delivered its verdict. Charles Stuart was found guilty of being a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy to the good people of this nation. He was sentenced to death by beheading. The king tried to speak after the sentence was read, but he was silenced and led away by the guards. The morning of Tuesday, January 30th, 1649, was bitterly cold. The Thames was frozen over and a thick frost covered the ground. Charles rose early and dressed with care, putting on 2 shirts so that he would not shiver from the cold. He did not want his enemies to think he was trembling with fear. He prayed with his bishop and said his goodbyes to his 2 youngest children, who were allowed to visit him. At 10 in the morning, the soldiers arrived to escort him from St. James's Palace to the banqueting house at Whitehall. A massive crowd had gathered in the streets around Whitehall, kept back by ranks of soldiers. The scaffold had been erected outside the banqueting house, draped in black cloth. Charles walked with a steady step through the hall where he had once danced in masks, and stepped out onto the wooden platform. He looked out at the sea of faces, but the soldiers kept the people at a distance, so few could hear his final words. He addressed those on the scaffold, declaring his innocence and claiming that he was the martyr of the people. Charles declared that he died a Christian according to the profession of the Church of England. He turned to the executioner and gave him his forgiveness. He then removed his cloak and laid his neck upon the low block. After a brief moment of prayer, he signaled the executioner by stretching out his hands. The axe fell in a single clean blow, severing the head of the king. A collective groan rose from the crowd, a sound that one observer described as such a groan as I never heard before, and desire I may never hear again. The executioner lifted the king's head, but did not speak the customary words, "Behold the head of a traitor." The crowd surged forward, some seeking to dip their handkerchiefs in the royal blood as a relic. The soldiers quickly dispersed the mourners, and the body was taken away to be embalmed. The execution of Charles I sent shockwaves through Europe. It was the first time a monarch had been tried and executed by his own people in the name of the law. The divine right of kings had been shattered by the axe. With the king dead, the monarchy was abolished, and the House of Lords was disbanded. England was declared a commonwealth and free state governed by the Rump Parliament and a Council of State. However, the new republic faced immediate threats from all sides. Royalist resistance continued in Ireland and Scotland, where Charles II, the son of the executed king, was proclaimed the rightful monarch. Oliver Cromwell was dispatched to Ireland to crush the rebellion there, a campaign that would become infamous for its brutality and the massacre of garrisons at Drogheda and Wexford. After subduing Ireland, Cromwell turned his attention to Scotland, where the Presbyterians had allied with Charles II. At the Battle of Dunbar in 1650, Cromwell won another miraculous victory against a vastly superior Scottish army. The final act of the Civil Wars was played out at the Battle of Worcester in 1651, where Charles II was defeated and forced to flee into exile. The young prince hid in an oak tree to escape the parliamentarian patrols, a story that would become a legend of the royalist cause. The wars were finally over and Parliament was supreme. The experiment in republican government proved difficult to sustain. The Rump Parliament became corrupt and ineffective, prompting Cromwell to march in with troops and dissolve it by force in 1653. He famously shouted, "You have sat too long for any good you have been doing lately. Depart, I say, and let us have done with you. In the name of God, go." Following this coup, Cromwell was installed as Lord Protector, effectively becoming a king in all but name. He ruled with a mixture of military strength and religious tolerance, attempting to heal the wounds of the nation. Oliver Cromwell died in 1658, leaving a power vacuum that his son Richard was unable to fill. The country, tired of military rule and the strict Puritan moral code, began to yearn for the stability of the old order. In 1660, General George Monk marched south from Scotland and arranged for the restoration of the monarchy. Charles II returned from exile to joyous celebrations in London. The experiment was over, but the world had changed. The king had returned, but he could never again rule with absolute authority. The English Civil War left a deep and lasting scar on the collective memory of the nation. It established the principle that the monarch cannot govern without the consent of Parliament, and that the law is superior to the king. It laid the foundations for the constitutional monarchy that exists in Britain today. The struggle between king and Parliament was a painful birth of modern democracy, forged in the fires of battle and the blood of thousands. The whispers of that time still echo in the halls of Westminster, reminding all who govern of the ultimate power of the people.